much for coming. I'm so happy to be in conversation with Nash. It's one thing is I was having a conversation recently with some other writers, and I was like, they were basically saying like, oh, we don't like to read first novels because we like people to like kind of get more practice or something. And I was saying I love first novels because I feel like so often they contain this like intensity of like everything the writer has lived up to that point, even if they're not at all autobiographical. And I totally feel like there's so much richness and like thought and emotion and anyway, and it's also reading this, it's like a book that I if I hadn't been in conversation with you at a bookstore, I would still have been like, I really want to talk to the author and, you know, like say my thoughts and ask questions, and it's such a joy that I actually get to. So welcome to Minneapolis.
Thank you.
And congratulations
Thank
on
you.
writing your first novel, which was
Thank you.
published 2 weeks ago yesterday. It's very special and exciting. Okay, so should I just start asking you? Are you ready?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say like the enthusiasm is like so mutual. I said that we had dinner beforehand, and I sat down and I just like laid my cards on the table, and I was like, Curtis, like I'm here as like a fanboy, right? Because like, you know, it's impossible to write a boarding school novel in the 21st century without the shadow of prep sort of hanging over it, right? Like I'm not saying this to be nice. It like almost single-handedly updated the genre of the campus novel, the prep school novel for, you know, the contemporary age. Like, and like I read it last week, you know, for like probably the 5th time, you know, when I found out we were doing this event together, and I was just like struck at how right it gets it. So I was very nervous to come here and talk to Curtis because I've been obsessed with Curtis's work forever. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for coming. And now you can ask a question.
I know. Well, it's like a mutual fan club. Okay, so how? This is a very basic question in every sense, but how did you decide to write this novel, and why did you decide to write this novel?
So it's a you know, I don't remember a time in my life where I wasn't infatuated by stories about adolescence. This was obviously particularly true when I was that age. I mean, I think, you know, to be 14, to be 15, to be 16 is to like sort of exist in this contained emotional tempest. And like as a teenager, I was always really drawn to works that like were able to lyricize that emotional experience. And like I think campus novels in particular are like a particularly poignant case of this. And even before I went away to boarding school, so I left, I grew up in southeastern North Carolina, left after 9th grade to go to the Lawrenceville School, which is New Jersey, down the road from Princeton. Even before then, I had this vague inkling that I wanted to one day write a boarding school novel. Just because like boarding school as a world fascinated me, and you know, it was sort of rarefied and exotic, and that actually had nothing to do with my decision to go away to school. I went away to school because, like many sensitive 15-year-old boys, I thought my world was too small and needed, you know, to escape it. And I knew when I was at Lawrenceville that one day I want to eventually write a book about this. You know, yes, because I want to write the sort of novels about adolescence that I love to read. You know, because I want to finally write the boarding school book that I've always wanted to write. But like more crucially, I wanted to write it down because I was worried I'd otherwise forget the way it felt. I had this vague sense that the way it feels to be that age is sort of unique in its intensity, and as I got older, it would wane. And I knew that if I didn't transcribe it in the form of fiction or some other form, I would lose it. And so I went into college, and I was in the creative writing program at Johns Hopkins, and I was like, okay, I want to write a boarding school book. And the book as it existed in my head at that time was really just like the Nash Jenkins story, right? And then eventually I realized like my memoir is not remotely interesting enough to like justify a book-length story. So this book in particular began with a short story I wrote almost like arbitrarily for a fiction workshop my sophomore year at Hopkins, and it takes, you know, it is a 12-page version of the story in this book. It's set the night before Foster is expelled from Kennedy, the boarding school in New Jersey he attends. And I sort of knew as I was writing it, like, okay, this is the story I want to ultimately expand. This is the boarding school novel I've been looking for. So, like, the short answer is I wanted to write this book in some form pretty much for as long as I can remember. But it was about 10 years ago that like the story first came to me.
And so, okay, wait, did I understand correctly that you wanted to write a boarding school novel before you went to boarding school?
It's really bizarre, and I'm being completely honest and straightforward when I say that my desire to write a prep school novel had absolutely nothing, at least consciously, with my decision to go to boarding school.
I think I could maybe, as an outsider, weigh in.
I'm almost certainly like deluding myself, and like feel free to hold me accountable. But you know, I think, but here's this is how I'll sort of rationalize it by sort of intellectualizing it. I, growing up in southeastern North Carolina, always felt constrained by the world I lived in. I mean, I was from a southern town where, you know, families had been there for 150 years, including my dad's own family. My dad is super, super southern, super old school, super traditional, and I was this, like, shrill, annoying 14-year-old who, like, read Wikipedia and campaigned for Obama. And, like, I just had designs on some form of escape, and I always fantasized about, like, what that escape would look like. And boarding school, to me, was this sort of rarefied, romantic place that existed as almost, like, otherworldly, somehow, you know, transcendent compared to what I was used to. So, like, I think, you know, I wanted to write a boarding school novel before I went to boarding school because boarding school represented something so much bigger and so much more sort of mystical than what I knew. And that sort of sense of mysticism, I think, is what ultimately drew me to, like, say, okay, time to leave North Carolina.
And did you come from a family where other people had gone to boarding school, or how much did you have to take the initiative?
It's a, you know, so my parents are an interesting part. That's a weird way of describing their marriage. An interesting partnership. They're very much in love, and they're great. My dad is like a good old Southern boy whose family like came over on the Mayflower and has been in North Carolina since like 1710. My mom's family immigrated from Eastern Europe like 20 years before my mom was born. They met as undergraduates at the University of North Carolina, you know, got married, had us, whatever, blah, blah, blah. My dad went to boarding school in Virginia, as did his siblings, as did his father, as did his grandfather. My mom, who grew up outside of Philadelphia, knew precisely no one who'd gone to boarding school. So it had always sort of existed in, like, the familial ether as, like, a thing we could think about doing, right? My dad was always like, oh, well, I went to Virginia Episcopal and I had a nice time there. So, like, you know, he, like, you know, it was always a thing he would float. And he'd always mentioned Lawrenceville simply as an example. That's where I went. Lawrenceville was an example of a really, really good school. So my parents had lived in New York and then moved to the suburbs in New Jersey, which is where I was born, which is how my dad knew it. And so me applying to school was something that I ultimately did on my own. But I was supported by my dad. He was like, oh, this is great. Like, I'll take you around to the schools, blah, blah, blah. I don't think my parents thought that, like, I was actually going to go. I think there was, like, oh, it's another weird thing that Nash is doing, like, and talking about, but it's, like, not actually going to come to fruition. So, like, when I decided to go away, you know, both my parents were supportive, but it was still really, really foreign to my mom. Like, I remember my mom weeping the day they dropped me off at Lawrenceville, and she was like, I just didn't know I was supposed to say goodbye to you at 14. And I was like, well, it's a little dramatic. But also, but I get it, right? So, like, you know, my dad went to boarding school, but to a very different type of boarding school. Like, the schools in the South are, you know, they're great schools, but I don't want to say country clubs, but, like, they appeal to a very certain contained demographic, whereas schools like Lawrenceville, at least on the face of it, are a little more meritocratic, a little more academic, and yes, there is a whole politics of class there as well. But, like, I didn't really have anyone in my sort of immediate orbit who could, like, relate to my experience when I was there, if that makes sense.
Well, and so just to kind of understand, the school in the novel is called Kennedy.
Yeah.
And when I, you know, wrote my boarding school novel, something that I feel like I've said many times over the years is I'll say, you know, the setting of the book and the sort of rituals and schedule of the school in prep are based on Groton, which I attended. But I don't feel like it's like a quote unquote true story. I don't feel like it's autobiographical or the main character is a stand-in for me, even though most people who read it assume it is.
Sure.
But would you say that's a description of Kennedy's relationship to Lawrence? Like is Kennedy Lawrenceville in terms of like the layout and the kind of traditions, or is it not Lawrenceville?
I would say that Kennedy is to Lawrenceville what Groton is to Alt, the boarding school in prep. Like I would be lying if I said that like my initial motive to write the book wasn't to sort of transcribe my experiences at Lawrenceville. And when I first set out to write Foster Dade, Lawrenceville is what I had in mind. And I don't know if you experience this when you write, but when I set out with an idea, in writing fiction, the idea invariably evolves through the process of writing. And when you're beginning with an idea rooted in nonfiction, that evolution inevitably means a pivot towards a more fictional identity, right? So, like, when I set out to write Kennedy, I imagined Lawrenceville. I imagined the campus of Lawrenceville. I imagined the dormitories where they are. I imagined the layout of the campus and the lawns. I borrowed the general sort of like academic calendar, some of the rituals that sort of define the weekly experience. And as I wrote, the school evolved towards fiction largely to sort of suit the flow of the story, right? There were things that happened in the story that happened to Foster that couldn't have happened at Lawrenceville for a variety of bureaucratic reasons, so I had to like embellish and fictionalize a bit more. But like, yeah, when I see Kennedy, I see the broad shape of Lawrenceville, and this sounds sort of like really hokey, but like when I think about the ways in which Kennedy is like the most truthful representation of an actual place, it's less in the sort of literal geography or the literal existence or the literal identity, and more in just like the weird, ineffable feeling of the place, right? There is a way it feels to be at these schools, to feel like you belong suddenly to this weird grand mythology that precedes you and will outlast you, and to which everyone else belongs, but you're just trying to sort of find your way in. That was what I really wanted to replicate. Like, I wanted to replicate the way it felt to be there more than the actual there, if that makes sense.
I think that you did both. You have a couple times characters say something along the lines of, because obviously it's a sort of, I'm sure some people have read it and some people haven't, but it's sort of a framed story where Foster is the protagonist, but it's somebody else who's telling the story, a student who's slightly younger than he is, who's doing all this research and reporting, and a couple times characters say something like, who cares at this point about a bunch of like rich white prep school kids? And is that is that a stand-in for something you think or you anticipate readers saying, or like if somebody says, why are you, not everyone is rich and not everyone is white, but most people in the book are rich and most people are white.
Yeah.
And so if someone said to you, like, why are you, writing about, or like, who cares about all these rich white characters? Like, what would your response to that be?
Yeah, totally. So to answer your first question, there are moments in the book that are very sort of self-aware in that respect, and I did sort of write them from a defensive crouch, right? Like, there was this moment in the last decade, right, where the culture began to shift in certain ways that suddenly made me feel very, very insecure about the fact that I was writing a long book about a boarding school populated disproportionately by privileged, largely white kids. But at that point, I was so wedded to the idea. I was like, I'm not going to just like let it go because I'm worried about what the critics might say. But I did feel like I needed the book to have a certain degree of self-awareness, right? Because it is a strange time to, be coming out in the world with a 600, 550-page novel that sort of is unabashedly... It's not a romanticization of a particular place or demographic, but it's also not like a scathing satire of it either. And I guess my answer to those people who might say that, okay, why in this cultural moment do you feel impelled to write, this particular book? My answer is very unsophisticated. It's really just like, this is the book that I've needed to write for a very long time. And that, again, that's something else that sounds hokey, but I do feel like this story comes from like a weird primal need. And it's like, to your point about first books, right? Like, I'm sure in 20 years I'll look back on the fact that I said this and laugh at it, but like I really don't think I'm ever going to write a book that is as personally meaningful to me as this one, just because like it is the culmination of everything I have wanted to say for however many years, and it is also a portrait of a very, very, very visceral time in my life. And you know, my answer to those critics would be like, this is my story, and it makes me feel a lot better to tell it. And maybe some people will like it. I didn't mean to hurt you with it. I support you. You should read it. But no, but it's, you know, it's tough, and it's a question that I sort of flinched in thinking about my answer, because I never know what I'm going to say that might betray a certain I don't, you know what I mean though?
No,
like,
I mean I definitely think that I think that writers tend to write the books that are like that have the sort of subjects or ideas that we are obsessed with or we are haunted by. Like I don't think I mean, and I definitely think too that this does feel like a labor of love. Like you sort of, I think when you're talking about like writing the book that you're compelled to write, to me, that is a persuasive answer. Like it's sort of, I don't think most, there are some writers, but I don't think most sort of like raise their finger to the air to see which ways the winds are blowing, and like, because it's hard. If I mean, not that I wouldn't do this and try to game the system, but it's just impossible to do.
Yes,
unfortunately.
as I am slowly learning. Yes.
So I want to get to kind of like a structural question.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you make the choice to have? And it's actually in this moment I'm realizing, do I not know the narrator's name, or do you not give him a name?
The narrator does not have a name.
Okay, but it's told, you know, we're privy to all these details that, of course, no one really could have been privy to if they weren't present in the scene, which I like that kind of impossibility. Why did you decide to make this like a told story instead of just, you know, having to be like a third person story with no first person narrator about Foster?
Yeah, so I would say there are three interwoven answers to that question, and I'm going to do my best to like be succinct, because I do love to talk, as Curtis knows from dinner. So
I love to talk to. I love to give long-winded answers. So please answer at any length is perfect.
Yeah, and when we're here at like 10:45. No, so I mean the first answer is that decision, the decision of how the book is narrated and constructed and told was a decision born of indecision, right? I never knew if I wanted to write a story told by Foster in the first person, or if I wanted a sort of, you know, classical omniscient third person narrator. And like I could go back to my old laptops from like 2014 and find a number of Word documents where like I experiment writing a chapter in Foster's voice, and in the end, so there are chapters in the book that are discrete posts from Foster's blog, which is basically his diary, and which is a great example of me wanting to have my cake and eat it too. So like the narrator's third person voice is interspersed with Foster's first person voice. I think the problem, you know, so the decision of like having the narrator be this sort of like faceless, anonymous, but nevertheless human embodied voice, I think the problem was I was doing grad work, and I was getting my master's in English at the time, and when I was like really diving into the book and reading like a tremendous amount of like really arcane literary theory about how like all omniscient narrators are like a fallacy, blah blah blah, that every narrator must actually have a voice. It was like really horror, and I'm so happy I'm not doing my PhD in English, but I really grappled with these questions, which, you know, were ultimately academic and meaningless, but it's like, okay, when someone is telling a story, who is telling it, right? And I think I'm almost certain that for whatever my second book is, it'll probably just be written in the voice of a classic omniscient third-person narrator, and that'll be so liberating. But like I wanted the narrative voice to come from someone. So yeah, like as Curtis was saying, the book is told from the present day by a kid who arrives at Kennedy in the immediate aftermath of Foster being expelled. Foster's expelled in the spring after this huge scandal, read the book, and then the narrator arrives as a new sophomore the following fall, and he is sort of transfixed by the story of this scandal and this kid who was expelled and disappeared from campus, and he's been haunted by it, and years later he's sort of journalistically reconstructing it. And like, you asked about the degree to which the book is autobiographical, and like, if it is autobiographical, and if I am to be found in the book in any meaningful way, it is in the form of the narrator. And now I read all these Goodreads reviews that talk about how insufferable and pretentious the narrator is. But I mean, I remember vividly, I was so fatally earnest when I arrived at Lawrenceville as a new sophomore, in part because I felt like I'd stumbled upon this world with these codes and logics and rituals to which I was not privy. But there were stories like that. Like, I remember hearing stories about kids who'd been kicked off campus, or kids who'd left unceremoniously after some debacle of some sort, and they felt like these necessary fibers to this mythology that I was like trying to crack the code of. And I was sort of haunted by them, right? There were these faceless people who had come before me who sort of made this world feel so much larger than life. And like, did I, 10 years later, end up taking one of those literal scandals and devoting several years of my life to like journalistically reporting it out? No, because I would probably been like institutionalized, because it's objectively bizarre what the narrator's doing. But like, the narrator to me was a way of sort of conveying that sort of wonder I felt at that age, to be in this world that I didn't really understand, that I knew was somehow poignant. And the fact that I didn't really belong somehow made it more poignant. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes.
Many answers.
Yes,
yeah.
They all make sense.
Yeah.
Well, another kind of question about form is you include like the music that Foster is listening to, and you recreate various like text threads, which I love the juxtaposition of the sort of like elegant language that you often use, and then the like slang, abbreviations, and typos and whatever in the texts. And what made you decide to kind of like, I mean, I might describe this as like a maximalist novel. Like, what made you decide to go with those different forms and include, like, do you have the expectation that the reader might pause and like listen to some of the music that Foster listens to, or is it like, well, you can if you want to, but
Sure. Well, the shortest and truest answer is that it's your fault. I'll tell you why. So as I mentioned at the beginning, like, prep is like, I mean, it's a masterpiece of a novel, and again, it was impossible for me to write a prep school novel at the time in which I was writing a prep school novel and not be constantly thinking about prep, its influences on my work, the inevitable comparisons, between the two, assuming my book gets talked about enough to warrant those comparisons. And one of the things that I think is like the most majestic about prep is its timelessness, right? Like, there are a few points in the book where you sort of situate the story historically, but like, and I remember having conversations, because it came out in a couple years before, like 06, right? 06? Yeah, well, right before I came to Lawrenceville, I remember people were reading it, and we talked about how true the story was to our experience, 25 or 2015, however long, after, like, it could have just as easily depicted 1970 as 1990 as 2020. And I remember thinking, like, there's something I really admired about that sort of timelessness, right? But it was one of those points where I was like, if I try to do the same thing, I'm gonna be my book's gonna be compared unfavorably to prep, because prep does it beautifully. So I decided instead, and again, because the book, was born of so much nostalgia and this sense that I was gonna lose the way it felt to be that age at that place, and I decided to sort of like extend that nostalgic project to the very specific historical moment of my years in high school. I was like, I'm nostalgic for my time, my adolescence, but I'm also nostalgic for the like broader historical and cultural backdrop that like shaped my adolescence. And I think that's true of everyone's teenage years. The cultural setting is like inseparable from the experience of that time, but I also think I came of age at a point when media, and by virtue culture, was beginning to be ubiquitous in a way it maybe wasn't always, right? Like, we were the Facebook generation, right? And Facebook, had this insane novelty that sort of jived really nicely with the novelty of being 15, of being 16. And I was like, okay, it's really difficult when I look back on my own adolescence and the experiences and emotions that I want to transcribe in fiction. It's really difficult for me to abstractify, if that's a word, my experiences from these various mediums that were like instrumental to like how we interacted with each other, how we understood ourselves, right? And like I did always love the like maximalist, multi-textual, David Foster Wallace, like grandiosity, right? Just and mostly because I'm a nerd and I love documents and I love encountering the different media forms that bring a world into being. And I was like, I need music, right? Music, like, it's really tough to write a book for me about adolescence that doesn't foreground music, because when in your life is music more meaningful than it is when you're 16? And iTunes was our vehicle in 2008, 2009. So that was a way where I could be like, okay, I can foreground the music. I'm sort of showing and not telling, but whatever. Like, it's also a way of like foregrounding like the cultural moment by virtue of the technology. As to your question about like the playlist, I do in fact have a Spotify playlist that is like a compendium of every playlist. So so in the book, a couple of chapters are Foster's iTunes playlists from various points in the story. I do have a Spotify playlist that is every playlist combined, and the nice folks at the publication online Large Hearted Boy had me do like a little put together a shorter version of that playlist and like write a little like list of songs or like a little paragraph.
Wait, how would we find it on? I mean, I always feel a little skittish. I know that like with to musicians, Spotify is what certain online booksellers are to write. But that
is it not cool that I plugged it?
I think it's okay. I think it's like whatever. We all have. I mean, I subscribe to Spotify. I was absolving us before I say what's it called. How do we find this?
Okay, just don't tell anyone. Search for me on Spotify, Nash Jenkins. My profile picture is me dancing at a wedding, and you go to my public playlist, and it's like a bunch of playlists from like my various runs, and then somewhere in that list, it's Foster Dade : the playlist.
So we could also go to your run.
You can listen to like the Cyndi Lauper I listen to when I like waddle down the street.
Wait, I have a sort of separate question. Well, sorry, am I cutting you off?
Not at all. No.
Playlist wise.
Yeah, no.
So I find this really fascinating. You're getting your PhD in the field of essentially communication or media and technology, right? Yeah. And I feel like from the outside, or that you got your master's degree in English, from the outside, I think there would seem to be overlap between like the academic way of writing and studying writing and then writing fiction and devouring fiction. But I actually feel like they're opposite way. Like they're almost like they're just close enough to be like magnetically repelled by each other and almost to be opposites. And so how do you I guess this is sort of a double question of, are you using different parts of your brain to write fiction and then to write like a super analytical paper, or is it like, this? Because I also can see as a sort of professional, studier of and producer of media and articles and stuff. I can see how that influenced the book, but like, do you feel like those two areas of focus complement each other, or are kind of in opposition to each other, or some of both?
Yeah, they're frenemies, I think. So I am slowly coming to terms with the fact that the like creative literary side of my brain and the sort of like sociological analytical side of my brain do not necessarily always belong in the same room, or rather one will sometimes try to overstep its boundary into the other. Like, so for example, like I've had to learn the hard way that like when it comes to writing a good academic paper, the lyricism of the language could not matter less, and many times is like in fact like not encouraged. And like when it comes to like writing fiction, like I am, like I was saying, like this sort of a Wikipedia nerd. I love knowledge, and I love learning about the way things work and the way that worlds or institutions or cultures come into being. I love procedural information. I love bureaucratic information, and I think I do a lot of that in Foster, and I think if it works, and I think there are probably folks who think that it doesn't, it's because I have a very good editor who was able to get those, those 2-page digressions were once upon a time 15 pages each. But like, again...
What percent longer did the book used to be?
Do you even...
Roughly.
The first draft of the book, which I finished on January 15th, 2021, and sent to the inboxes of my 2 agents, one of whom is in the audience tonight, but I'm not going to embarrass her, was 974 pages long. Quite literally biblical. But anyway, now I'm embarrassed. But no, it's tough, right?
And then how many manuscript pages? Because obviously manuscript and book pages can vary. How many manuscript pages was the final draft? Let's be very specific.
Well, it's tough because I had to, like, my agents very kindly told me, like, we are not going to be able to sell a 974 page book from an unknown 28-year-old. I was 28 I was 28 then. Yeah, 28-year-old kid. So I cut it down, right? So the version we ultimately sold to Overlook was, I think, 710, and like they somehow managed to get that down to like Zach did a lot of editing. He was very ruthless in a great way. Zach's my editor. Zach Knoll, he's the man.
He's lovely. I too know Zach.
Yeah, mutual friend.
I'm very fond of him.
But yeah, so it was, I think, the final version in Microsoft Word was 630 pages that they then typeset magically into 540. Yeah, well, it's funny, like, everyone's always like, when you're doing a reading, it's like, oh yeah, roughly a minute per page, that's the rule. And then I realized just how much text they compressed onto a single page, because I'll do a page and it'll be like 3 minutes long. Oh no, what was that? Okay, so no, you're talking about like the academic versus literary thing, right? Because like I love human stories, right? Like I mean, it sounds so like banal, right? But like it's one of the things again I love about prep, like you just describe in such pointed but lyrical ways. I think this is how I described it to you at dinner, just like the mundane humiliation of like crossing campus at 15 and worrying that everyone's looking out the windows at you, laughing at you, right? Like, and I love the human experience. I love like fiction that bottles those sort of very human experiences, but I also love the grand sort of social commentary novel too, right? Like I love that sort of maximalist social analysis. And like I think one of the I think if I succeed in Foster in sort of interweaving the like intimately human and like the broadly macroscopically social, I think it's probably by accident. Because like there have been times where I've like sent a proposal for a novel to my agents, it's like an 18-page outline of some dystopian story set in like an alternate future United States where I like go into the nitty-gritty of like how the government works, and like this would be a really, really interesting like academic paper, but like no one would want to read this, even like the weirdest like Tolkien people, so like it's tough, right? Like I feel like they do complement each other in some way, shape, or form. But there are things that like belong on one side of the dance and things that belong on the other, and like I would love to find a way to merge them a little more effortlessly, because I think they have a lot to contribute to each other, right? Like I think fiction that only looks at itself is a little, I don't want to say tedious. I don't want to insult any other writers, because I don't want them to insult me. I think the academic and the literary have a lot to learn from each other, but it's tough. It's like a weird, convoluted answer, but yeah.
No, I mean, it's interesting. Well, and again, do you think that this book is more influenced by your academic experiences, not like your sort of graduate academic experiences, or by your media experiences? You spent a few years as a journalist.
Yeah, so I think the voice, the narrator's voice, which is sort of self-consciously pseudo-academic, was a voice I didn't really find until... So I started writing the book finally after like 5 years of equivocating and trying to outline it in my head and failing. I began writing the book in earnest in the summer of 2018 and wrote like 180 pages in like 6 weeks. And then I started my master's at UChicago and didn't touch the book for a year because I was just like living in the library, like reading Hegel or whatever. And then the following summer/fall, I was house sitting for a professor and applying to graduate programs, and that's when I returned to the book in earnest. And it was only then that I realized I had sort of found the narrator's voice, which does these sort of like shrewd or like pretending to be shrewd cultural analyses and dissections, and I think I inherited that, yeah, from a lot of the like the sort of academic voice. Like, in a way, it's a parody of that sort of academic voice, but it also takes what it has to contribute quite seriously. But then, you asked about my time as a journalist. I mean, a lot of like my interest in like narrative journalism and long form journalism and in just like the way media circulates and takes shape more generally was definitely an inheritance from my time when I was a reporter. And like honestly, one of the many reasons I left Time in the summer of 2018, I mean, it was mostly because I was covering U.S. politics in like the first year of the Trump administration, and like the country had lost its mind, and like I felt like powerless to say anything smart about it. But it was like also because like I had grown up like stealing my mom's copies of New York Magazine and Vanity Fair because there were a lot of stories about sex in there, and that's where I first sort of discovered like the long form literary magazine piece as a form. And I remembered being so enamored of it, like, because not only was the language lyrical and beautiful oftentimes, but the fact that it referred to something true that had actually happened made it feel more poignant to me. And in that sense, that's what I was trying to get at in sort of making the book the narrator's long-form journalism project.
Okay, I have like one more question, and then we can turn it over to see if people in the audience have questions. Is there a passage that was especially like pleasurable to write, or this could be a totally different question, or that you just feel very proud of it? And then this could also be the same. This would all be one answer and multiple answers. And would you like to read maybe a little bit of it just to give a flavor, and then we'll go to audience questions.
Cool. Yeah, totally. So I'll give you a taste of the sort of pseudo-sociological voice that I dabble with in the book. So on page, I'm going to do 45, and this is one moment where the narrator sort of steps back from Foster's story to like tell the reader a little bit more about how the world works. And in this case, he's talking about the way that privilege, or more pointedly, the lack of privilege, inflects one's experience of a school like Kennedy, which I think would be true at really any place like this. It's fairly brief, so it won't hold you captive for too long. But here we go. For at least a generation, since the earnest bourgeois solemnity of Dead Poets Society collapsed into the lazy salaciousness of Gossip Girl, American cinema and television have dutifully imagined boarding school as the domain of fuck-ups. The fuck-ups themselves in these portraits are themselves the sum of cliches: cokeheads, sluts, petty criminals, etc. The truth on its face is more banal. We can crudely organize the population of a school like Kennedy, or Choate, or St. George's, or any other first or second tier boarding school north of D.C. into certain categories in a broader taxonomy. Let's start with a group I'll call the haves for simplicity's sake. The haves are those teenagers who go off to school simply because they hail from circumstances of affluence and or analogous geographies, towns like Darien, Connecticut, or Locust Valley, New York, in which doing so is simply standard practice. Their fathers went to boarding school, perhaps their mothers did too. Within similar tax brackets, we have those from less patrician origins and more cerebrally inclined households, who see the top boarding schools as express lanes into Yale or Stanford. In Kennedy's case, it's the day students who overwhelmingly sustain this demographic, hailing from the academic enclave of Princeton or the incommensurately Chinese or Indian American towns of Edison or West Windsor. At first glance, we see little cohesion among them. Indeed, these halves operate within their own smaller taxonomies of power, defined by the prosaic metrics of adolescent social capital, which perhaps unjustly always come down to sex. No one, for example, is going to pretend that the varsity lacrosse captain and the executive editor of the Canadian operate on the same rung of the venereal food chain. What unites the haves is something more impalpable, legible by comparison with the shape of those who covet it: the have-nots, as it were. We find it in the quiet cadences of the haves' movement through these worlds, in the way they comprehend deep in their marrow that these places were constructed essentially for them. The haves very quickly gravitate toward those who share this instinct, like stray moons falling into orbit. Confidence always compounds itself, and in time, the haves, in their easy navigational elegance, are the leading players in their spellbinding production. The editors and star writers on the Canadian or the Rubrum, Kennedy's literary magazine, the admissions office's head tour guides, or those who go on stage at school meeting on Fridays and lean insouciantly against the podium to tell their 800 peers to come out to the lacrosse game against St. Paul's the next afternoon, concluding with a wry in-joke that only their fellow halves possess the contextual knowledge to understand. And there, silent and invisible in the darkness of the auditorium, are the have-nots, deafened by the incomprehensibility of their classmates' laughter. They too are a diversely multicellular group, even if no one takes the time to contemplate it. This subpopulation is mostly white or Asian American. With certain exceptions, those Canadians of African American or Hispanic heritage, many of whom were brought to Kennedy from places like the Bronx by nonprofit fellowship groups by virtue of their 7th grade scores on the ERB or Iowa tests, tend to hang together, building their own rich and complex biomes within this vaster foreign frontier. Ditto the rich South Koreans, except with more cigarette smoking. We could say that what unites the have-nots is simply the inverse of what unites the haves, the inverse of that unlearned ease. And this wouldn't be wrong, but it allied something more primal. The closest synonym would be naivety. In almost all these cases, the have-nots arrive in these worlds on their own. They are the bright, earnest sons and daughters of electricians in Dayton or car salesmen in Altoona. Maybe they'd read a separate piece in 8th grade. Maybe a sympathetic guidance counselor nudged them to boarding school. They almost certainly don't watch Gossip Girl, but perhaps they've seen Dead Poets Society. They have no contemporary point of reference to argue against the assumption that these institutions are utopian, kingdoms where effusive chit-chat prefers topics like Shakespeare and Tolkien over crushes and shopping malls. In other words, the traits for which they've been ostracized or ignored in their public middle schools are instead celebrated at places like Kennedy. To their parents, the notion of prep school holds a cultural and socioeconomic foreignness on par with Mediterranean holidays and evenings at the opera. But when they see their child's face renewed with the same light that the bullies of late childhood had fought so hard to stamp out, and when they read the 4-page letter detailing the terms of the full financial aid package their child had applied for with the help of that guidance counselor, they relent. One more paragraph. It would be several weeks after their arrival on campus before the have-nots realized their parents' skepticism may have been something other than mere ignorance. It's then that, for the first time in their lives, even for those with the most merciless bullies back home, they come to truly know shame. Its incendiary light is grotesque in what it illuminates. The cheap shapelessness of the blouse they'd spent the summer saving up for, the expression of disgust upon the face of the pretty blonde girl with whom they tried to strike up conversation after class. They realize with growing distress that intellect here is a weak currency, largely by virtue of its oversupply, and that their own bullish entry into the market in fact amounted to showing up on the NASDAQ floor with fistfuls of Guinean francs or Vietnamese dong. What qualified as brilliance in their home school district is not only devalued but deprived of basic fungibility. When it comes to academic success at a school like Kennedy, all the raw intelligence in the world can't buy the esoteric knowledge and rhetorical training provided by $25,000 a year East Coast middle schools. They retreat abruptly into the shadows, burning with silent humiliation, loathing themselves for being naive enough to assume they were welcome.
Thank you. That gives me a little PTSD to hear. There's also, in addition, for those of you who have not yet had the enormous pleasure of reading the book, in addition to all the anthropological insights, there's lots of juicy sex scenes too. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Not for Foster, as apparently I and other people feel tempted to call him, but for Nash. Don't be shy. Yes.
Nash, would you say that you liked boarding school? Is it something you would do again? Actually, Curtis, for you too. Would you comment on that?
Would I do it again? I'm too old. I can't think of a period of my life that means more to me than the 3 years I spent there. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. You know, it's funny. I 2 years ago, would have been my 10-year reunion, but COVID shut that down. So my friends and I got together in California at a friend's house and spent the weekend together, and we all were talking just about how hard it was being there, how so often we each privately felt so lonely and ostracized, like socially the cards were stacked against us, how the kids who were cool were really just assholes who were cool because they decided they were cool. I mean, why weren't we cool, right? And I mean, there were two sort of insights I took away from that conversation. One was we'd all felt the same way, even though at the time, to me, I felt like I was the only person there who didn't have the wherewithal to fit in. You know, so we were all too ashamed to admit this alienation to each other because we felt like feeling estranged. It felt like a confession that we'd been defeated, that we weren't supposed to be there. But the second takeaway was that that experience, the emotional intensities, the highs and the lows, mostly the lows, is really just like adolescence, right? Like being a teenager is being a teenager is being a teenager. And sometimes it sucks, and sometimes it's wonderful, and sometimes it sucks. And it's in the nature of boarding schools, just by virtue of the fact that they're so contained, right? You live there. You don't go home at the end of the day. It is your entire existence, quite literally, except for the 3 months a year when you go home for summer. It takes those intensities and ramps them up tenfold, right? So that means the lows are a lot lower, but the highs can be like almost majestic. That sounds so corny, but I'll in 2 weekends I'm going to New York. One of my best friends from Lawrenceville is marrying his Lawrenceville girlfriend, and I've been texting with two of my friends because I'm gonna stay on their couches that weekend because I'm a poor graduate student and can't afford a hotel, and I've been traveling a lot and I'm exhausted and I'm worn down and I just want to sleep, and I literally cannot think of a weekend I'm more excited for in the next 8 months than this, because I get to see my friends and I love my friends, and yeah, I'm happy I went.
It's funny. I mean, so also just to contextualize this, I'm 47. We were talking about this. So prep came out for me the same amount of time after my boarding school. I graduated from boarding school in 1993, and then prep came out 12 years later, which is true for you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It takes 12 years to gestate a boarding school novel. So one thing I will say is that even now, as I'm staring down 50 in the not too distant future, I dream that I'm a student at boarding school again, and I'm sort of like my current age, and I'll think it's weird because I'm pretty old to be a boarding school student, and then I'll be like, I guess I'll just go with it. There's some pros and cons, but so I mean, it definitely has a grip on me. And we talked about this at dinner. I just went to my 30th boarding school reunion, and I went to 2 colleges, which might explain, but I have never been to a reunion for either of them. But I also will say, I think that I feel a little more distance maybe than it sounds like you do, just in the sense that, I don't know, there are times when I feel that, I mean, the sort of saying of the past is a foreign country or something, that the grip that boarding school to some extent, I mean, it was definitely very literally formative, but that there's no there's nothing to go back to. I mean, I enjoy seeing my classmates, and on the whole they're lovely, and if some have sort of, I think, maybe intentionally disappeared, and I feel very curious about what happened, why did you disappear, and even though I also respect their right to do that, but so it kind of, I think it's really, as you're saying, it's really hard to untangle, maybe there's something about boarding school where we all feel haunted by aspects of our adolescence, but if you went to boarding school, you were haunted in a really beautiful, privileged place, and that's a weird intersection of emotions to have, and it's something that I think the book captures that beautifully, where Foster is so deeply unhappy so much of the time, and feels so consumed by being there and doesn't really wish that he was elsewhere, which also, I mean, again, I do think that, like, I've sometimes chased just, like, the emotional intensity of boarding school, which has been hard for me to find. Is there anything, before we go into our group therapy, are there any other questions, or is there, Jim?
One on that way of, like, the intensity of it, right?
Yeah.
And so he does it in so many ways. Like, I really, in some ways, could see this as a drug novel, right?
Yeah.
Like, the world of drugs that he engages in as his arc unfolds, and I won't spoil it, but in that way, like, he's both trying to activate parts of himself and dull them as well. And so, I guess for me, like, thinking as an educator, and I work in a private school, and I went to boarding school, and I taught at one, and, you know, so many levels to this book speaks to me. But I think in that way, like, the world of his addiction, right, and those involved in it, and the stakes of it are really high, because these are kids using stimulants to try to get better grades.
Yeah.
And, like, but he uses them in every way. It's like a party drug and a study drug, right? It's work hard, play hard, all around. And then there's all these other things he gets into. Like, how did you engage in that, and how hard was that, right? Because I feel like, as I think about a book like Demon Copperhead, I don't know if anyone's read it, but, like, this reminded me as much about that book as it did of Crap or a Separate Piece, right? And the way it, like, kids get swept up in this world, he gets swept up in the dealing of it, and the serotonin he gets from people liking him in the library as he's handing these things out. What was it like to write that? How did you get inside that head? Because I found that fascinating and terrifying too. It's not a romanticized world of drug use.
Yeah,
the
sure.
campus is beautiful.
Yeah.
But you're never like, oh my god, they're having the best day getting high and running down to the bridge.
Yeah.
But they all just seem like it's about other stuff.
No, totally, and it's funny, right? Like the presence of drugs in the book with respect to, like, the scandal, right? So Foster gets expelled for this, like, huge multinational Adderall ring that he's the center of, was, like, largely incidental. When I wrote that short story many moons, like, literally 10 years ago, almost to the day, you know, I knew I wanted this kid to get expelled. I needed a sort of cause for his expulsion, and I sort of landed on that, like, arbitrarily, knowing that, like, oh, you know, rich kids selling drugs at boarding school, sort of a cliche, blah blah blah. So I threw it in there. You know, it was nothing more than like a precipitating force for his expulsion. And then by the time the book began to evolve in my head, I felt like I was kind of stuck with it, right? But you know, in a way, that aside, the scandal aside, Foster as a character is not me. He's much cooler and, more to the point, much quieter than I will or could ever be. But his pain is very much my own. I don't think I hurt as sort of tragically or consistently as Foster hurts in the book, but, like, simply his mundane experience of being new at Kennedy and lonely and insecure, like, that was very much autobiographical, and Foster relates to his pain through substances in a very unhappy way, in a way that arguably compounds the pain and makes it worse. And, like, you know, I'm not shy about the fact that, like, that has also been an experience of my life, right? Like, I quit drinking and doing drugs when I was 22, living 8,000 miles away in Hong Kong, because, like, if I didn't stop, I was, you know, very precociously going to die. And, you know, the pain, the feeling, the emotions that I knew just from my own living of life were the emotions I wanted to put into fiction. And for me, they were so bound up for many years in the, like, somatic and psychological experience of, oh my God, every drug under the sun. You know, and again, like, I say this at the very, very end, of the narrator says this at the very, very end, like, the drug, you know, it's easy to turn drug use into sort of allegory, right? As, you know, in ways that sort of romanticize the way the drugs make you feel. And, like, I don't know, someone, you know, I think you could probably say that, like, every generation could be understood through the, like, its primary drug of choice, the 60s, LSD, you know, the 80s, cocaine, whatever. You could probably say the exact same thing about, like, my generation, Adderall, with our super gung-ho striving, whatever. But that's not really, you know what I mean? To me, the drug use, you know, the drug ring, the scandal was sort of an incidental thing. The drug use was really just meant to be a way of articulating Foster's pain in a way that I knew it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Jim, from an English teacher. No. All right, thank you all so much, and thank you, Nash, for sharing your time and your literary talent with us in Minneapolis.
Well, thank you, Curtis, for coming out and chatting with me and having dinner. We had really good chicken wings before. And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.